And Christian identity is rooted in a series of very basic convictions. And the first one is that it is God who is the creator of all things. And therefore, at the core of our identity as God's people, we are all brothers and sisters together, made in the image of God. That is the place where we begin in naming our identity. The second area that we begin with is that because God has created us, then all of us are formed in the imago Dei, in the image of God, who is the creator. Which means, thirdly, the third conviction that we have is that God in Christ and through the Spirit is at work in the world through the brokenness that we have and who we are, calling back into being one whole healed creation. And this really gets picked up most clearly in Ephesians chapter 1, where it says that the secret of the whole universe has been revealed, that from the beginning of time, God has been at work in Christ, bringing back together the whole of creation. And so our conviction is that the understanding of Christian identity begins and is rooted in the one who created us in the imago and the one who is healing and redeeming and bringing all things back together, which is an identity that's quite different than over against and different from. So that's the place where we begin, this conviction of who we are in Christ. The second thing comes from the fact that we encounter this God, and our identity is discerned and shaped in the other. It is in our calling and our relationship with the other that our identity is formed. Or another way of putting it is that our identity as God's people or as individual Christians is not formed primarily in our own personal inner life, and it's not formed primarily only in the gathering of Christians together talking about who they are, but it's this: to the extent that we are discovering how to be with and how to embrace the other, to that extent, we are discovering and our identities as God's people are being formed. Because we are created, all of us are created in such a way that the only way we can see the face of God is in the face of the other, those who are not us. And it is only as we see the face of God that we are awakened to ourselves. Now, let me say that again. It is only in the face of the other that we see God. And it is only when we see the face of God do we begin to see ourselves, our own identity. So Christian identity is rooted in this understanding of who we are in relationship to the other. Which gets to the question of hope, which is one of the questions I hear all the time. Where do we find our hope? Where do we discover it? And I think today, many of us as God's people are having a hard time finding the hope and the energy that we believe is there, because we, at this moment, are fixated and are focused on ourselves, getting our congregations to work, getting ourselves to understand where we are. But our identities are not going to be formed by trying to fix who we are, trying to manage who we are as congregations. Our identities start to get formed when we, as God's people, God's particular people, are invited to join with the other, and in the other to see the face of God. Now, that's not the only place where identity is formed. It's formed in our liturgies, in the way when we come together, we confess who God is. When we gather around the table and take the Eucharist, it's this interrelationship of the life we form liturgically and the life we form with the other, that as Christians, we begin to discover identity.